The first time I realized my brother actually hated me, I was 9 years old, and he left me stranded in the woods. It wasn't just a dumb prank. He wanted me scared. He wanted me lost. And worst of all, he wanted me to know that no one was coming to save me. It was summer, and our parents had dragged us to some family friend's cabin for the weekend. The kind of trip where adults drank too much wine by the lake and pretended to enjoy the outdoors while secretly hoping for cell service. Jake was 13, which meant he had just hit that age where tormenting me wasn't just fun. It was an art form. He'd spent the entire morning pushing me around, flicking my ears, kicking dirt onto my shoes. Little things, subtle enough that my parents wouldn't care, but cruel enough that my stomach stayed in knots whenever we were alone. And then, when I finally snapped and shoved him back, he grinned, like he'd been waiting for me to fight back, like that was exactly what he needed to take things further. "You want to be tough, huh?" he sneered, grabbing my arm in a vice grip. "All right, let's see how tough you are." I barely had time to struggle before he dragged me down a narrow, overgrown path behind the cabin, deeper into the woods. I stumbled, tripping over roots, trying to dig my heels into the dirt, but Jake was stronger, faster, and I was just some dumb little kid who still thought my big brother would never actually hurt me. The trees got thicker, the sunlight dimmer, and when he finally let go, I realized I had no idea where we were. I turned to run, but Jake blocked my path, shaking his head like he was disappointed in me. "Nah, you wanted to be a big man, right? Find your way back." My mouth went dry. "Jake, stop playing. Let's just go back." He laughed, actually laughed, and I remember thinking how strange it was, how different he sounded when no one else was around. "Oh, don't be such a baby," he said, stepping back, arms wide like some game show host unveiling a grand prize. "You'll figure it out." Then he turned and jogged off, disappearing into the trees before I could even process what was happening. For the first few minutes, I stayed put, convinced he'd come back. This was just another one of his tricks, just another way to scare me before running back to the cabin, laughing about how easy it was to mess with his little brother. But then the minutes stretched longer, the shadows shifted, the wind picked up, and suddenly it wasn't a joke anymore. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, and the rustling of leaves sent panic creeping up my spine. I started walking, calling his name, then yelling it, then screaming, because suddenly I was really alone. And what if he actually didn't come back? What if this time, he actually wanted something bad to happen to me? I walked for what felt like hours, the sun dipping lower, my heart pounding against my ribs. I tripped more than once, skinning my knee, scratching my palms, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The thought of spending the night in those woods was enough to keep me moving, even when my legs ached, even when my throat burned from shouting for help. Then, just when I thought I was well and truly lost, I heard a voice. Not Jake's, a man's. Deep, calm, coming from somewhere up ahead. "Hey kid, you all right?" I froze. The man stepped out from behind a tree, wearing a fishing vest, holding a tackle box in one hand. He looked concerned, maybe a little confused, but not dangerous. "What are you doing out here alone?" I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, another voice cut through the trees. "Hey, there you are. Jake." I turned and saw him jogging towards us, his face twisted into an expression of perfect, practiced relief. He grabbed my shoulder, squeezing just hard enough to make me wince. "Dude, Mom's freaking out. I told you not to wander off." I blinked up at him, stunned, my brain struggling to keep up. Wander off? The man looked between us, frowning. He was pretty far out here for just wandering off. Jake just laughed, easy and charming, like he wasn't the same person who had left me to rot in the woods. "Yeah, he does that. Kid's got no sense of direction. Thanks for keeping an eye on him." The man hesitated, like he wasn't totally buying it, but I just stood there, silent, too exhausted and overwhelmed to fight back. Maybe part of me didn't want to see what would happen if I did call him out in front of a stranger. Maybe part of me still thought my parents would never believe me over Jake. So I let him take my arm, let him lead me back towards the cabin, and when we were far enough from the fisherman, he leaned down, his breath hot against my ear. "If you ever tell Mom and Dad, I swear to God, I'll make sure you really get lost next time." I didn't say a word. I didn't have to, because I knew, for the first time, that this wasn't just brotherly teasing. This wasn't just a game. Jake hated me, and I had no idea how much worse it was going to get. I didn't forget what happened in the woods, but I stopped talking about it. That's how things worked in our house. If Jake did something, it wasn't a big deal. If I complained, I was making a scene. And if I ever tried to explain how bad it was, my parents would just sigh and tell me I was overreacting. So I learned to keep my mouth shut, but that didn't mean I stopped paying attention. I started noticing things. How Jake would smile at Mom while kicking my ankle under the dinner table. How he'd punch my arm just hard enough to hurt, but not hard enough to bruise. How he made sure everything he did was just on the edge of being unprovable. It wasn't just bullying. It was control. And the older we got, the worse it became. High school was when things really started falling apart. Jake was a senior, and I was a sophomore. He had spent years building himself up to be the guy everyone liked, the captain of the football team, the one teachers trusted, the one who could charm his way out of trouble with nothing but a lazy grin. And I was just his loser little brother, the one no one noticed unless Jake made them notice. It started with small things, like how he'd accidentally bump into me in the hallway, making me drop my books, or how he'd spread little rumors, stupid things like saying I cried during a movie in class or that I was scared of the dark, stupid things that should have meant nothing. But in high school, even the smallest rumor can ruin you. And it worked. People started laughing when they saw me. They started treating me like a joke, like I was just Jake's weird little brother and nothing else. Then one day, he took it further. I was in the cafeteria, sitting alone, picking at my lunch and trying to ignore the noise around me, when I heard my name. Jake was standing on one of the tables, holding up my notebook, flipping through the pages like he had just found someone's secret diary. I froze. I knew what was in there. It wasn't anything bad, just sketches, dumb little drawings I did when class got boring. But that didn't matter, because Jake had already decided to turn it into a joke. "Hey, everyone, look at this," he called out, grinning as he held the notebook up like some prize he had won. "Turns out my little brother is a real artist." I pushed up from my chair, heart hammering, legs shaking, knowing I had to do something, knowing there was no way to stop this. "Give it back," I said, trying to sound calm, trying not to show how badly my hands were shaking. Jake just laughed, flipping to a random page. "Ah, this one's cute. Did you really spend all this time drawing wolves? Dude, are you 5? The people around him laughed, but I could barely hear them over the pounding in my ears. I tried to grab the notebook, but he pulled it back, holding it just out of reach. "What's wrong?" he said, his grin widening. "You embarrassed? You think this is cool or something?" The worst part wasn't even what he was saying. It was how easily people went along with it. They didn't care that I was standing there, fists clenched, face burning. They didn't care that I had never done anything to them. They just saw Jake laughing, and they decided that was enough. I didn't say anything else. I just turned around and walked out of the cafeteria. I could still hear them laughing as I left, could still hear Jake calling out after me, making some joke I didn't bother listening to. I walked straight to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and sat there for what felt like forever, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of how this had become normal. When I got home that night, my notebook was sitting on my bed, pages slightly crumpled, a note stuck to the cover. "Chill out, man. It was just a joke." I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash, but I didn't touch the notebook. I just left it there, like looking at it would somehow make things worse. After that, something shifted. Maybe Jake realized I wasn't going to fight back. Maybe he just got bored and wanted to try something new. Either way, the jokes stopped being just words. They became actions. He started taking things, small stuff, things that were easy to write off as misplaced or forgotten. My phone charger, my homework, my shoes right before I needed to leave for school. And every time I brought it up, he'd just shrug and say I should keep better track of my stuff. Then, one day he took my bike. It was the only thing I actually cared about, the one thing I had saved up for myself. I rode it to school every day, locked it up in the rack like always. But when the final bell rang and I went outside, it was gone. I searched everywhere, but I already knew who had taken it. When I got home, I found it leaning against the garage, the tires caked in mud, the chain half broken, the handlebars bent like someone had deliberately slammed them into the pavement. I stormed inside, shaking with anger, barely able to keep my voice steady. "You took my bike." Jake was on the couch, feet kicked up, scrolling through his phone like he couldn't care less. He didn't even look up. "Yeah? So what?" I took a step closer, fists clenched at my sides. "You broke it." That made him look up. He smirked. "Looks fine to me." I wanted to hit him. For the first time in my life, I actually wanted to hit him, but I knew how that would end. If I started a fight, I'd be the one getting blamed. If I broke something, I'd be the one paying for it. So I did the only thing I could do. I went upstairs, slammed my door, and sat on my bed, shaking with anger, staring at my broken bike through the window. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about everything he had done, every time he had made my life hell, every time he had laughed while I suffered. And I realized something. This wasn't going to stop. Not unless I made it stop. And I had no idea how, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done letting him win. I kept my head down for weeks, going through the motions while Jake went on like nothing had happened. My bike stayed broken. The frame bent just enough to make riding impossible, and every time I saw it leaning against the garage, I felt that same anger crawling back up my throat. I wanted to do something, to fight back, to get even. But I had no idea how. Fighting him wasn't an option, and telling my parents would be useless, so I did what I always did. I endured. But something had changed. I wasn't just taking it anymore. I was watching. I was waiting. I started paying attention to the way people acted around Jake, the way some of his so-called friends laughed along with his jokes but never actually joined in. I noticed the way a few of them would glance away when he got particularly cruel, like they didn't want to be associated with it. Most of them didn't care, but some of them were just going along with it because they didn't want to be on his bad side. Then one afternoon, everything shifted. I was in the library after school, trying to work on an assignment, when I felt someone sit across from me. I expected it to be some random classmate, but when I looked up, I froze. It was Liam. Liam wasn't one of Jake's closest friends, but he was always around. He played soccer, was good at school, and had that kind of easy confidence that made people want to be around him. He was popular, but he wasn't cruel. He wasn't the type to start fights or humiliate people just for fun, and as far as I knew, he had never gone out of his way to mess with me. He was just there. But right now, he was sitting across from me with a serious look on his face, like he had something to say. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "I know you hate your brother." I blinked at him, caught completely off guard. "What?" he sighed, glancing around like he was making sure no one was listening. "Look, I don't like Jake. I never have. He acts like he runs everything, and people just go along with it because it's easier than dealing with him. But after what he did to you in the cafeteria, I figured it's about time someone actually said something." I stared at him, trying to figure out if this was some kind of trap. No one had ever stood up for me before, especially not someone like Liam. "Why do you care?" "Because I can't stand guys like him. And because, honestly, you don't deserve that." He sat back, crossing his arms. "I see the way he treats you. It's not just some stupid sibling rivalry. It's personal. And it's messed up." I wanted to argue, to push back, to tell him I didn't need his help. But the truth was, I did. I was tired. I was done. And if someone, anyone, was willing to stand with me, I wasn't going to push them away. "So what are you saying?" I asked, watching him carefully. He smirked, but there was no malice in it, no cruelty like the kind Jake always had. "I'm saying it's time someone gave Jake a taste of his own medicine." I didn't know what to think. I had spent my whole life knowing that Jake always won, that no matter what I did, he would find a way to twist it back on me. But for the first time, I wasn't alone. Someone else saw it. Someone else knew. Liam leaned forward again, lowering his voice. "I have an idea, but you have to trust me." I hesitated. Trust wasn't something that came easily anymore. But then I thought about everything Jake had done, everything he had taken, and I made my choice. "All right," I said. "I'm listening." Liam glanced around again before speaking, his voice calm but deliberate. "Jake has a weakness. You probably don't see it because you've been stuck dealing with him your whole life, but trust me, he's not untouchable. Guys like him? They only stay on top because people let them. They need control. They need people to laugh at their jokes. They need to believe that no one can ever turn things around on them. He leaned closer, tapping his fingers against the table. The second people start seeing cracks in that image, it's over. I wanted to believe him, but this was Jake we were talking about. What are you saying? That we just embarrass him and suddenly he stops? No. I'm saying we take away his control. Liam smirked again. But this time it was sharp, like he had been waiting for this moment. You know how he gets away with everything? How no one ever calls him out? That's because he controls the story. He decides what people believe. But what if, just once, we flipped that on him? I could feel my heart pounding, not out of fear, but out of something else. Something that felt a lot like hope. How? Liam sat back, crossing his arms again, clearly enjoying the moment. Jake's not as untouchable as he thinks. I know things. Things that would make him very uncomfortable if they got out. And before you ask, no, I'm not talking about anything illegal or dangerous. Just things that don't exactly fit the perfect image he's built for himself. He raised an eyebrow. You interested? I hesitated, but only for a second. Yeah. Liam grinned. Good. For the first time in years, I felt something shift. Jake had spent his whole life making sure I felt small, making sure I knew I couldn't win. But now I had something he didn't. I had an ally. And if Liam was right, if Jake really did have cracks in that perfect image of his, then maybe, just maybe, he was about to learn what it felt like to be on the other side for once. Liam had done his part, but I wasn't going to just sit back and let him do everything. If this was going to mean anything, if I was ever going to stop feeling like I was stuck under Jake's control, I had to act. Watching from the sidelines wasn't enough. I needed to be the one to make sure Jake felt what it was like to be powerless, to lose control, to realize he wasn't untouchable. That night, I went through every shred of proof I had against Jake. I didn't have much. He was too careful, always making sure there was no direct evidence of what he did to me. But there were moments he had slipped, times he got cocky and let his mask fall just enough for me to catch it. And I had one thing that would expose him for who he really was. A few months ago, I had left my phone recording in my backpack when Jake and his friends were messing with me in the locker room. He didn't know it at the time, but I had caught everything. His voice was clear, bragging about how easy it was to push me around, laughing about how our parents never believed me no matter what he did. The way he spoke, so casual, so confident that he could get away with it forever. It had burned into my brain. At the time, I hadn't known what to do with it. But now I knew exactly how to use it. The next morning, I got to school early and headed straight to the computer lab. I logged into one of the generic student email accounts and sent the audio file to the school's biggest drama page on Instagram. It wasn't the kind of page that spread lies. It was the kind that exposed people who deserved it. And once something was posted there, it spread fast. By the time first period started, the post was already up. The caption was simple. Ever wonder what Jake's really like? Underneath it was the audio clip, crystal clear. The reactions were immediate. People started whispering, playing the recording on their phones, looking at Jake differently. It was just a few minutes long, but it was enough. Enough to show the side of him he had always managed to hide. Enough to make people realize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the person they thought he was. At first, Jake didn't seem to notice. He walked into school like he always did, expecting the same attention, the same respect. But as he moved through the halls, the shift became obvious. People weren't laughing at his jokes. Some of his own teammates were giving him weird looks. A couple of the guys who always stuck by his side suddenly weren't standing so close. He wasn't used to that. He wasn't used to people questioning him. Then came the next hit. Liam had done exactly what he promised. The fake account Jake had been using to trash talk his teammates? The screenshots were everywhere. The guys on the football team were pissed. They had always been loyal to him, backing him up no matter what, but now they weren't so sure. The things he had said about them, how they were useless, how they didn't deserve to be on the field with him, were impossible to ignore. Jake had built his reputation on being the leader, the one everyone looked up to. But now, His own team was looking at him like he was a joke. Lunchtime was when everything exploded. I was sitting at my usual spot when I heard the yelling. I turned to see Jake's girlfriend standing in the middle of the cafeteria, her face red, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. People were already gathering around, whispering, waiting for the inevitable scene. "You think you can play me?" she snapped, shoving her phone in Jake's face. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Jake shifted uncomfortably, glancing around like he was searching for an escape. "Babe, come on, it's not like that." She cut him off before he could finish. "Oh, it's exactly like that. You really thought you could talk to another girl behind my back and get away with it?" She turned on her heel, shaking her head. "We're done. Enjoy being alone." People started laughing. Someone clapped. Jake just stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face going redder by the second. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but for the first time in his life, there was nothing he could do. Then came the final hit. Mr. Thompson, Jake's history teacher, appeared out of nowhere, standing right behind him. "We need to talk about your last test." Jake stiffened. His eyes darted to his teammates, his now ex-girlfriend, the crowd still watching him. For once, he wasn't the one in control. He wasn't the one deciding how things played out. I didn't stay to watch what happened next. I had already done what I needed to do. For the first time in my life, Jake had lost. And this time, there was nothing he could do about it. Jake didn't show up to school the next day. I knew because for the first time in years, I walked through the halls without feeling his presence lingering behind me, waiting for a moment to strike. People were still talking about what had happened, playing the audio on their phones, going through the screenshots Liam had leaked, sharing their own stories about Jake that they had never felt comfortable speaking about before. The shift was real. It wasn't just about one bad day or a single piece of exposed truth. It was everything adding up at once, forcing people to see Jake for what he really was, not the version he had carefully built for himself. When I got home that afternoon, I expected some kind of explosion. My parents had to know by now. They might not have cared about how Jake treated me, but they definitely cared about the image of our family, and Jake being humiliated in front of the entire school wasn't something they could ignore. But when I walked through the front door, the house was quiet. My mother was in the kitchen, but she didn't say anything to me, just kept wiping the same spot on the counter over and over like she wasn't sure what to do with herself. My father was in the living room, his arms crossed, staring at Jake, who was sitting on the couch, silent, his face unreadable. I stood there, waiting, expecting them to start yelling, to demand an explanation, to find a way to blame this on me. But nothing happened. My dad let out a sharp breath, rubbing his forehead before finally speaking. "What the hell is wrong with you?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was no mistaking the frustration behind it. "I got a call from your coach today. You're off the team. You're done." Jake didn't respond. He just sat there, his hands clenched together, staring at the floor like if he just kept quiet, everything would go away. "I don't even want to repeat half the things I heard about you today," my father continued, shaking his head. "Cheating? Talking about your own damn teammates behind their backs? And that account?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Jesus, Jake, do you know how stupid you look right now?" My mother finally turned from the counter, her voice hesitant. "Maybe this is just a misunderstanding." My father shot her a look. "A misunderstanding? There are recordings, Karen. There are screenshots. You think the whole damn school just made it up?" Jake's jaw tightened, his shoulders stiff. "It wasn't that serious," he muttered. My father slammed his hand against the armrest. "It was serious enough that I had to sit through a conversation with the principal about whether or not you were even worth keeping in that school. You think this is a joke?" For the first time, Jake looked up, his eyes flickering to me. There was no anger there, no threats, no smugness, just frustration, like he was searching for a way out, but none of his usual tricks were working. "This is your fault," he said, his voice tight. I expected that. What I didn't expect was my father's reaction. "You don't get to pull that crap this time," he snapped before I could even respond. "You dug this hole yourself." Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but even he knew there was no getting out of it now. He turned back toward the floor, his face unreadable again. My father let out another sigh. rubbing his face. You're grounded. No car, no phone, no going out. And if you think for 1 second you're getting a free pass after high school, you better wake up. You want to act like an entitled little punk? You can figure out how to handle things yourself from now on. Jake didn't say anything, but his hands clenched tighter, his knuckles turning white. I watched, waiting for my parents to turn on me, to accuse me of setting him up, but the moment never came. My mother looked uncomfortable, like she wanted to find a way to defend him but couldn't, and my father was too busy being pissed off to even acknowledge me. That was fine. I didn't need them to say anything. I had already won. That night, I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for Jake to come storming into my room, to do something to prove he wasn't completely beaten. But my door never opened. There was no confrontation, no threats, no desperate attempt to reclaim control. He had nothing left. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. Jake avoided me for the next few days. He stayed in his room, barely spoke during meals, left for school without waiting for me. The few times I saw him, he just looked tired, like he was still processing the fact that he wasn't in charge anymore. People still talked about him at school, but not in the way they used to. No one was laughing with him anymore. They were laughing at him. His old friends kept their distance, his teammates had completely cut him off, and the girl he had been sneaking around with wanted nothing to do with him now that he had been exposed. It was like watching a house collapse from the inside out. One afternoon, as I was grabbing my things from my locker, I felt someone standing behind me. I turned around, expecting to see Liam, but it was Jake. He looked different. No smirk, no arrogance, just quiet. We stared at each other for a long moment before he finally spoke. You happy now? I crossed my arms. Are you? His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond right away. For a second, I thought he was about to try and start something, but instead, he just let out a breath, shaking his head. Whatever. That was it. No threats, no insults, just nothing. As he turned and walked away, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't scared of him anymore. He had spent years making sure I felt small, making sure I knew he was always going to win. But now, he wasn't winning. He wasn't anything. And that was enough.